It is the morning of the 25th of October, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, and Henry V of England is in serious trouble. He has roughly 9,000 men, thousands of them too sick to fight, strung out along a muddy farm track in northern France. Ahead of him, blocking the road to Calais, stands a French army that outnumbers his by somewhere between 3 and 5 to 1. His men haven't eaten properly in weeks. Dysentery is tearing through the ranks. The nearest safe port is still days away. By every conventional military calculation, what is about to happen should not be possible. What happened at Agincourt is one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of warfare, a story about terrain, technology, discipline, and catastrophic overconfidence. It is also a story that was nearly told very differently. Henry V had invaded France in August 1415 with imperial ambitions rooted in a legal claim he considered genuine. The 100 Years' War between England and France had been grinding on for decades, but the French crown was weakened by internal division. King Charles VI of France suffered from recurring episodes of severe mental illness. He sometimes believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. His court was split between two rival noble factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who hated each other almost as much as they hated the English. Henry read this disorder as opportunity. He landed in Normandy with around 11,000 men and laid siege to the port of Harfleur. Harfleur held out for 5 weeks. It finally fell in mid-September, but the siege had cost Henry dearly. Disease, primarily dysentery. The great leveler of medieval armies had gutted his force. Thousands were dead or evacuated. With winter approaching, the sensible move was to garrison Harfleur and sail home. Instead, Henry made the decision that would define his reign. He would march his diminished army roughly 250 miles northeast to Calais, openly, through enemy territory. It was either a calculated act of provocation or a genuine gamble, possibly both. He was daring the French to stop him. The French obliged. Their army assembled along Henry's line of march, growing larger as more contingents arrived, until they had somewhere between 12,000 and 36,000 men. The historical sources vary wildly, but the English were massively outnumbered by any estimate. Near the village of Agincourt, they positioned themselves across the road and waited. The battlefield Henry rode into on that October morning was narrow, perhaps a kilometer wide at most, hemmed in on both sides by dense woodland. The forest funneled both armies into a confined corridor and stripped the French of the one thing their numbers should have given them: room to maneuver. They had chosen the ground, but they had not thought carefully about what it meant. The French plan was straightforward in principle: mass their nobility-heavy cavalry on the flanks, send in dismounted men-at-arms through the center, and crush the English by sheer weight. But the ground between the two armies was freshly plowed farmland, recently soaked by autumn rain. It had become thick, clinging mud, and the French formation, men packed in shoulder to shoulder, heavily armored, waiting, was cramped from the beginning. The lords and knights had all pushed forward to claim the prestige of the front rank, and the result was a formation packed so tightly that men struggled to raise their weapons. Henry, surveying the situation, made a critical decision. He ordered his army to advance to within extreme bow range, roughly 300 yards, and then plant their defensive stakes and open fire. The English longbow was not simply a weapon. It was a weapons system built on years of enforced training. English and Welsh longbowmen spent their lives drawing bows with draw weights of up to 180 pounds, and it deformed them. Their skeletons showed dramatically overdeveloped left arms and asymmetric spines. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows a minute. Henry had approximately 5,000 to 6,000 of these men. When they opened fire at Agincourt, they released somewhere in the region of 50,000 arrows per minute into the French formation. The French cavalry on the flanks charged first. They were met with a storm of arrows at close range, from multiple angles, with nowhere to go. Horses are not armored on their faces or legs. They panicked, screamed, and wheeled back, directly into the packed infantry behind them, disrupting the formation before the foot soldiers had even begun to move. The survivors of those cavalry charges that did reach the English lines were met by archers with stakes and hand weapons. The dismounted men-at-arms advanced through the mud in full plate armor, in a confined space, already disordered by the retreating cavalry, being shot at continuously. Men fell and could not get up. Armor that weighed 40 to 60 pounds, designed for fighting, became a death trap in knee-deep mud. Those who reached the English line, exhausted, disorganized, barely able to swing a weapon, were cut down by lightly equipped archers who had dropped their bows and drawn swords. Mallets and knives, fighting in conditions where agility mattered far more than armor. The French front ranks collapsed into chaos. So many men fell that the dead and dying began to pile up, forming physical obstacles that further disordered the troops pressing in from behind. What should have been an overwhelming numerical advantage became a liability. There were simply too many men in too small a space, with too much weight and too little room to fight. The battle lasted perhaps 3 hours in total, though the critical phase was far shorter. Henry then made a decision that still troubles historians. He ordered the killing of the French prisoners already taken. His reasoning, most likely, was that he had received reports of a renewed French attack from behind, possibly on the baggage train, and could not afford to have thousands of armed men, even disarmed prisoners, at his back if the battle was not yet over. The attack, it turned out, was a relatively minor raid by local peasants, but the order stood. Hundreds of high-value prisoners, men who would normally have been ransomed for fortunes, were killed. It was brutal, arguably a war crime by the standards of the day, and Henry knew it. He faced criticism for it even in his own time. The final toll is difficult to verify precisely, but the broad shape is not disputed. The French lost several thousand men killed, including a devastating proportion of their nobility and high command: the Constable of France, 3 dukes, 90 lords, and 1,500 knights, among others. English casualties were somewhere between a few hundred to perhaps 1,000 men, a staggering disparity. Agincourt did not end the 100 Years' War. France did not simply fold, but the battle shattered the French military aristocracy, opened the path to the Treaty of Troyes 5 years later, and for a brief moment made Henry V the dominant force in French politics. He was recognized as heir to the French throne and married Catherine of Valois. Had he lived, history might have bent around him entirely. But he died in 1422, just 35 years old, probably from dysentery, the same disease that had haunted his army at Harfleur. His son, Henry VI, was less than a year old. The empire his father had seized began to unravel almost immediately. What Agincourt leaves behind is more complicated than triumph. It is a story about how battles are really decided, not by raw numbers, but by ground, preparation, technology, and the catastrophic cost of underestimating an enemy. The French had every reason to believe they would win. They had numbers, prestige, and home advantage. What they lacked on that particular morning, on that particular field, was the wisdom to let those advantages work for them. Henry had no such problem. He played a terrible hand brilliantly, and for one cold October morning in northern France, it was enough.